Good evening. This is Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation, and I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Chajua. Our guest today is Siphiwe Baleka, and Mr. Baleka is a former world-class swimmer and Yale graduate who has now become a leading strategist and advocate for global African repertory justice. For more than 2 decades, he has been involved with developing the African diaspora as the sixth region of the African Union and invoking Afro-descendants' right to return to homelands of their to their ancestral homelands on the African continent. Recently, he has led a campaign requesting an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the fundamental legal questions concerning our reparations. And in January of this year, he was appointed as Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Provisional Government of New Africa. I'm anticipating some problems. Mr. Baleka is in Guinea-Bissau, and he may be having trouble logging in. Let's kind of relax. I'm going to go back, play the intro while I try and contact him via phone.
Once before you travel, so
Yeah, I can't call him because he hasn't accepted. Oh, he says he's in the StreamYard chat. Okay, let me. This might be the problem. Okay. Let's see what happened. You know, I had opened up a StreamYard.
Okay, I don't hear anything.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Yes.
Good. All right, my brother, I deeply apologize for the technical difficulties. I was testing something and subsequently couldn't get back in, so I had to open up a new link.
Okay.
Anyway, it's a pleasure to have you here. I've read your bio, so let's get to it.
Okay.
So this is Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation. I've taken quotes from Samir Amin and from Walter Rodney to combine them to get the title of this show. So now, this is my first time meeting you, but I've been made aware of you for the past year or so, well, maybe 6-7 months, by State Representative Carol Amons, who's a big fan of yours, by the way. So on Real Talk, we try to be informal. So we operate on the basis of brother and sister and first names, right? So I want us to have a conversation. And, you know, I don't want it to be just like a kind of traditional interview. So there'll be some give and take. So I want you to try and be both comprehensive and succinct in your answers. And just be aware that my tendency is to try and interrupt in order to get clarification for the audience over things that I suspect they may not be aware of, as well as to sometimes to do a little pushback and challenge you. Right? Now, I always begin. I'm a big devotee of my friend Bill Cross, who is the foremost person on Black identity, right? The cross scale of Black identity. Negrescence is his theory. It's a French term that means blackness. And so it's come to be identified as the, quote, Negro to Black conversion process. And your story is rich in that regard. So I start with biographical stuff, right? Okay. So let's begin. I want you to tell us about yourself. Right now, I've got a sense that you were born in Montgomery, Illinois. So tell me about that. That's a western suburb of Chicago. And then where were you raised during your formative years? And put it in the social historical context. What was going on when you was coming up, right? What was going on? And then I want you to move us to the point where you're talking about how you transitioned to Blackness. All right, so.
All right. This is going to be rather enjoyable, I think. Thanks for that interesting introduction to the show. My name is Siphiwe Baleka. I am 53 years old. I have 3 children. I currently live in my ancestral homeland of Guinea-Bissau, where it is a little after midnight right now. Yes, I was,
you, brother. On this late, I appreciate that.
I was born and raised in Montgomery, Illinois, in 1971. My father, Jeremiah Blake, was born and raised in Gary, Indiana. Graduated from Fisk University in the mid-1960s. He was one of those early recipients of affirmative action. He had a degree in mathematics. And so he got what would have been considered a really good job in that time period. And as a result, we were the first Black family to move to a subdivision called Boulder Hill, Illinois, which is part of Oswego, Illinois, and Montgomery, Illinois, which is out there by Aurora, Illinois. So people understand that. So
it's toward Iowa.
What's that?
It's toward Iowa?
No, it's far southwest suburbs, 45 minutes southwest, southwest of Chicago.
Okay.
And in the early 1970s, it's mostly cornfields. And so I was somewhat of an alien, our family. If you can, maybe some of your listeners could identify and understand being the only Black family. When I graduated high school, I think there was something like 9 of us out of a class of just over 300. So, yeah, it was, I played sports, and it's an interesting thing. When you're a boy, if you're good at sports, you're accepted. My sister, who is 2 years older than me, we grew up in the same house, same environment. Because I was good at sports and I was a state champion swimmer at the age of 10, and I was playing football, I was a star athlete, I was in the newspaper. I kind of grew up with this, even though I grew up with a good, healthy sense of self-esteem, but my sister didn't. Because in that, for girls at that age, part of their self-esteem comes from their ability to attract boys, and those
That's
white
right.
boys didn't want my sister. So it's an interesting dynamic, something that my sister and I talk about and think about, and I've learned much from how we developed very differently. Like I said, by the time I was 10, I was a state champion swimmer. I was a star athlete in high school. So even though I was surrounded by white people, um, for the most part, I had a normal childhood. I was accepted, and I had great friendships, and I did well in school. And I didn't start to have that identity issues until after I got to college.
Can you give me? So you're 53, and I know some of us could just do the math, but the time period that you're growing up in, this is the late 70s and 80s, right?
Yeah, born in 1971. I graduated high school in 1989. So mid to late 1980s, I'm in high school. And, that mid 1970s to mid 1980s, I'm in elementary school and junior high school.
So you basically grew up as a hip hop era, black millennial, and so you're at Yale. You're experiencing. Let me use some of your language here to draw out
Okay.
some of this. So I was reading, online, and you describe yourself as part of W.B. Du Bois's talented 10th. And I think you spoke to that in terms of your athleticism, but you haven't spoken to it in terms of the cognitive, the intellectual aspect. I mean, everybody don't get into Yale, right? So
Exactly.
you're part of what Du Bois's talented 10th. And so I want you to talk a little bit about that, but also you raised this question about having had internalized racism. And like Malik Shabazz, you've gone through a series of names, and these names seem to mark different states of consciousness in your case. So the birth name, Anthony, Tony, Nathaniel Blake. And then at some point, and I think it may be the Yale years, you get influenced by Rastafarianism and you become Raz Nathaniel. And then you become Siphiwe Baleka, as you know now. But in your ancestral ethnicity, the Balanta, and I really want to talk about the Balanta. That's an amazing story, an amazing people. You've given the name Brasa Mada. So
Mm-hmm.
explain for my audience the states of consciousness that
Mm-hmm.
each name reflected for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so take us through that, what William Cross calls Negro to Black conversion experience using your name changes.
Okay. So to really understand this, I need to start with that scene from Alex Haley's Roots, because I remember, I was young. I think that came out in 1976 or 1977.
Yes,
I was about,
yeah.
yeah, I was 5 or 6 years old. And that was a phenomenon when Roots came on. And that scene where Kunta Kinte was whipped
Yes.
and struggled to defend his name, and finally he broke and he accepted the name Toby. That had a very deep, profound effect on me that manifested when I got to college, when I went to Yale. Before that, yes, my birth name, Anthony Nathaniel Blake. Nathaniel is my father's middle name and my grandfather's middle name. I never knew my grandfather. He had passed when my father was 5. So the only connection that I had to my grandfather was that name. So before going to Yale University, Tony Blake was this black swimmer who everyone talked about, could become the first black swimmer on the U.S. Olympic swim team. When I was 12, my father took me to see my uncle Hayes Jones, who won a gold medal at the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo. And so my father took me to see him. And at that time, I was running track. I was playing football. I was playing tennis. I had played baseball. I played basketball. I was doing everything. And my uncle, they took me into his study. And I remember he opened this cabinet drawer and he pulled out this box and he took the top off the box and he pulled out the medal. He put the gold medal in my hand and my hand dropped.
Wow.
So heavy. And he said to me, look, if you want to get one of these, you're going to have to pick a sport and commit to it. I was like 11 or 12 years old, and my father and my uncle, they did the math. They were like most, Olympic athletes. Well, first of all, I wanted to play football. My idol was Walter Payton, and I would run around the house pretending I was Walter Payton. Okay. Jumping over the bed like I was jumping over the offensive line, and I wanted to play football, but I was a small kid then. I'm small now. I'm 5'8", all of 140 pounds. I knew I would never be big enough to play, college football, let alone professional football. So I picked swimming by default, and my father and my uncle, they were like, okay, Olympic swimmers, they're 22, 23. So we're talking about a 10, 11, 12-year commitment, something like that. And they're like, 1992, which turned out to be the Barcelona Olympic Games. That would be sort of my window of opportunity. So I had dedicated my life from that point on, from I was 12 till 1992, to training to make the Olympic team. And that's how I ended up going to Yale. Yeah, I was a good student, but there weren't a whole lot of nationally ranked black swimmers at the time. So the world knew me as Tony Blake. And I could go to any swimming competition, and that's how they knew me.
Brother, let me tell you,
I got to Yale and
in the trials. I watched you. I was so proud for you. Was the first that I remember. You're the first black swimmer at that level. I remember watching you.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Actually, I wasn't the first. Let me call out Fred Evans, who actually swam in the Chicagoland areas. He was a generation before me. There was Chris Smith or Chris Silva. And then there were others that were in my generation. So I wasn't the first, but I was in that early group. But when I got to Yale, I ended up going to Yale it was kind of like the Olympics. If you get a chance to go to a school like that, you go. I didn't know anything about the Ivy League very much. I didn't know anything about Yale other than it was ranked #1 in U.S. News and World Report. And so that competitive thing in me, I want to be among the best, right? I want to be the best swimmer. I want to be the best athlete. I'm as good as anybody else. I didn't suffer from any kind of inferiority complex. So I'm like, okay, if this is the best school, I'm going to go there. But politically naive, my father was not very much into politics or religion, right? We didn't go to church. We weren't politically active. My father just, he liked his job and he liked being a good father. He was a great father. My parents had got divorced, so I was raised by my father. It was just me and him in the house. But I had the opportunity to go to Yale. I went. And after about 2 years there, I started to learn about the world. I started to become politically conscious. And that's when I started to have this identity crisis where I would look in the mirror and I would be like, why do I have a Spanish or an Italian first name, a Hebrew middle name, and an English last name? But when I look in the mirror, I see a black person. I see an African. And that came to a climax while I was at Yale.
Was there something going on in terms of the course? Were you taking Black Studies classes? Was there something on campus? What sparked that sense that there's you're alienated from your name when you see your reflection.
Um, I think I took a few Black Studies courses, but I was really studying. They had a new major called Ethics, Politics, and Economics. It was like three majors in one. So I was taking philosophy courses, political science courses, economics courses. I was also studying physics at the time. I spent most of my time with my teammates because we had to train before classes, we had to train after. So I'm on campus. I'm spending most of my time with my Caucasian teammates who I had great relationships with, no problems there. Um, I can't pinpoint what it was exactly that happened that provoked this profound introspection. Who am I? Why am I here? Um, Something's not quite. I start realizing what Yale is from a conscious perspective.
Uh,
I like to call it, the place of spiritual wickedness in high places. Okay. All right. I didn't know that going to Yale, but at some point in those 4 years, I started questioning that. And what am I doing here? And I think my great fear was, and you brought up Du Bois's talented 10th. I think that was my great fear. I realized I was somewhat privileged. I was in this space that most of us didn't have access to, and that um, I could end up being used as a tool for white supremacy.
yeah,
I could turn out to be something like an Uncle Tom, an Uncle Clarence, if you will.
okay,
And
yeah.
in those 4 years, I realized, no, I don't want that. There's something else out there for me. I don't know what it is yet, but going out and serving white people is not what I'm here for.
Mm.
Yeah. And
So,
then, well, in
so at that
1992,
moment,
I did.
at that moment, you're Anthony Blake. And
Mhm.
so, how's the process that you moved to become Roz Nathaniel? And I
So,
know it's spurred by the Yale experience, but how do you make that move?
so in my junior year at Yale, I didn't make the '92 Olympic team. I was crushed by that. I was lost, didn't know what to do with myself. Um, didn't want to swim anymore, but I had one more year of eligibility. My senior year, the coach convinced me to stay on the team because I had promised to win them a championship, and we had a chance to win the championship, but only if I stayed. But my heart wasn't in it. Um, and that's when the identity crisis came to a head. So at the last competition of the season, the regular season, we ended up winning the Ivy League championship. It came down to the last race. It was a relay race. I led off, gave them a lead. We won. 3 days later, I left school. And 2 months
Without
before
graduating?
graduation, what's it? Yeah, without graduating. I had 2 months before graduation. Um, I I left. I went home. I saw my father. I said, "Dad, I'm tired of reading about Jesus and the Buddha and all these other spiritual figures. I want to live like them. So I'm going to go travel around the world. I don't know if I'm coming home. When I'm coming home, if ever. I love you. Thanks." And then I was gone, and I left to travel around the world. And it was during that period that um, I started being influenced by these dreadlocked people who talked different and had a different energy about them, and had this sort of pride and dignity that was attracted to me.
Where did you meet him?
At first, I had met them. There's a Rastafari community in Chicago.
Yeah.
Um, in fact, Chicago had Frontline Books, which published a majority of the Rastafari books during that period. So it was in Chicago that I met them, and then through reggae music, listening to Bob Marley and Burning Spear and Culture and the
Yeah.
Abyssinians and all of that. Um, and so it was during that period I was traveling. Um, I was around Rastas. I was a swimmer, so my hair was shaved all the time. So the first thing I did when I left school is I made a vow that to symbolize my new freedom, I was going to let my hair grow. So after a while, I started having dreadlocks and spent more and more time in the community, learning, redefining myself, and Ross was the name that many people in my age group we were taking that name. I didn't want to be called Anthony. I didn't want to be called Tony. At the time, I didn't mind Nathaniel because it was a name that was in the Bible. Nathaniel was a friend of Jesus. He wasn't a disciple, but he was, like Jesus's friend, but a free thinker. And it was acceptable in the Rasta community. So I had taken the name Ras Nathaniel. I was traveling for some time, but after a couple of years, by this time I had my first child, my daughter. Everybody was saying, "Oh, if you just go back and finish and get your degree, then you can take care of her." And a part of me felt like I owed it to my father to graduate. So I only had one semester left, even though I had vowed I would never go back to Yale, because at that point, Yale was this symbol of Babylon. Like, the great hope of Babylon is their educational empire. There's no way I'm going back there. But mostly to honor my father so that I wouldn't deprive him of the thing that he had worked so hard for, which was to give me a good education and see me graduate. So I did go back. But I went back with the name Ras Nathaniel X. Okay, I had a Rastafarian identity. I was still holding on to what was given to me by my father and my grandfather. But as far as a surname, I don't know where I fit in the world. So I just took the X.
Well, were you in any way influenced by Malcolm, the Nation? Okay.
I was influenced heavily by Malcolm, but turned off completely by the Nation of Islam.
We'll circle
suits and bow ties and the whole Islamic. Yeah. So I went back to finish my last semester under the name of Ras Nathaniel X, and that was actually what they had initially put. I insisted that that's what they put on my diploma.
And so, how does Ras Nathaniel become Siphiwe Baleka?
So after I did graduate and get that degree, I immediately pursued what Marcus Garvey calls a racial re-education. Garvey had said that those of us that had that experience in Western educational institutions, if we were ever going to be of any use to the race, we had to have a racial re-education. Absolutely. And by that time, my heroes were people like Walter Rodney, who, by the way, this is the anniversary of when he was assassinated, right? So my heroes were people like Walter Rodney, Ken Saro-Wiwa of the Ogoni people of Nigeria, these brilliant intellectual scholars who said that, no, you have to have praxis. You have to use your intellect, your scholarship to be an activist. And so that's what I did for the next several years. I traveled to every kind of radical Black nationalist spiritual group I could find. So I started out with George Edwards, who was an original Black Panther Party member in New Haven, who took me under his wing and became my first sort of conscious mentor. From there, I was introduced to the friends and family of Mumia Abu-Jamal and the MOVE organization, and I spent time with them. And what I would do is I would go to each group and basically show up and be like, I'm here to learn, I'm here to serve, because I have this thing. I don't want to be Du Bois's talented 10th that is of no use to the race because you're serving the establishment, you're a tool for white supremacy. So the thing that was driving me was sort of proving myself to my people and my community that I wouldn't sell out. I wouldn't be an Oreo cookie, that I could be trusted, that I could contribute something. And so in order to do that, I had to go and find these communities and sit with them to see what I could do, what I needed to know and what I could do. And so after sort of taking that journey, I call it my ecumenical, because I learned, whether it was Aser Aset, whether it was Hebrew Israelites, whether it was Moors, whether it was Rasta, whether it was New African Independence Movement, you name it, right? I learned about their history, and that has helped me. But it was the Rastafari movement that I really spent the most time and gravitated to, so that by 2006, I had actually lived in Ethiopia for a year. I had lived in the Shashamani land grant in Ethiopia. I was working as a journalist for Rastafari Speaks newspaper and covering events at the African Union, which is how I got involved in international African diplomacy. And I helped organize the first National Rastafari Conference in South Africa. And so when I went to South Africa in 2006, it's a great story. The plane landed, and we're getting our luggage, trying to get ready to disembark from the plane, and I could hear these drums outside, right? And we could hear some kind of noise, some singing, and I remember saying, something's going on out there. I wonder what it is. When the door opened and I got to the steps to disembark, I saw 30 to 40 Rastas, right, outside the plane with their red, gold, and green and their flags and their drummings. And they were there to receive me because by this time I was well known in the Rasta community because I had been engaging African heads of state on the issue of repatriation and citizenship. And before I could go down the stairs, a council of elders came up to the plane and said, "Listen, Ras Nathaniel, it's our tradition that when a son of a soil returns home, they get a new name, a name that the ancestors can recognize so that they can call you. And so we're giving you, while you're here in Azania, South Africa, your name is Siphiwe Baleka." And they explained to me that Siphiwe meant gift of the creator, and Baleka meant he that escaped, but it also meant fast. And it kind of fit. And so that's how I got the name Siphiwe Baleka. It was given to me by this council of Zulu and Hosa elders that were part of the Rasta community. And it fit and it felt so natural and perfect that when I returned to the US, I had it legally changed. And that is my name on my passport, all my documents. And that's how I sort of reinvented myself.
And I'm seeing a movie here, brother. So you reconnect with your ancestral ethnicity, the Baleka, and they give you another name, Brasa Mada. So
Yes.
tell us about that.
So during that period that I had just described, of course, in the Rasta movement, we're taught about Africa. That's who we are. That is our origin. And so I had this connection. And by the time African ancestry DNA testing, that came out in 2003. So by 2006, 2007, 2009, I had heard about this and I realized, wow, I can actually find out who I come from in Africa. That's the best $300 I could think of spending. So I took the test and found out that my paternal ancestors are Balanta from Guinea-Bissau, and my maternal ancestry are Yoruba from Nigeria. Now, I had been exposed to Yoruba culture. I had been to Olatunji village in the Carolinas, and nothing about Yoruba culture resonated with me. It's like I'm learning about it, but nothing really it just didn't resonate with me. But when I started learning about Balanta, it like everything clicked. It was like a light bulb went off. I understood my life. I started doing a lot of genealogy research. I started tracing all my family history. I put all of that together. And so I really embraced my paternal ancestry. And I felt that though it was those ancestors that were calling me, guiding me, influencing me, intervening in my life. And they made a way for me to return to Guinea-Bissau, which is where they eventually settled in through the 10th through the 14th centuries. And Balanta people have been here ever since. And so now I'm here in my ancestral homeland. Abene Binhamne Youle. I just said, thank you, wise ancestors of the past, in my Balanta language.
Um, I'm amazed. But what I want you to do, because I don't think very many African Americans and Black folks in the West are aware of the Baleka ethnicity. And so while we now know that the Baleka and other African ethnicities who practice what some people have called pure democracy, but it's not pure democracy, but it was indeed far more democratic than what we know in terms of the West, right? So the Blanca are referred to as stateless societies in that they never had an aristocracy. Right? So can you talk about the Blanca? Because I do feel that a lot of Blanca and other similar African ethnicities had a big impact on African American culture in terms of the way before we entered into American politics in the 60s in a very gung-ho way, we tended to use more communal and democratic measures for making decisions. But talk to us about the Baleka.
Okay, so Balanta people. So it's Balanta, Balanta. Um, so the Balanta people, yeah, some of the words that are used to describe Balanta, sometimes they say stateless, other times they're talked about as being egalitarian or horizontal society. And that's because Balanta people never had chiefs or leaders or kings. Um, uh, Social scientists, they talk about the period in African history where we went from kinship societies, right, to kingship societies, which is a natural evolution. In a kinship society, the head of the household is sort of the highest political or sovereign unit. And then as a result of that, at some point, the elders of the oldest family have kind of more prominence in the community. And from there is developed the notion of kingship. It stems out of this. Balanta people never went through that evolution. Okay, so
Devolution.
Or devolution, yeah, correct, right? Yeah, I stand corrected. Balanta people originally started out in the Nile Valley, in a place called Tanahisi, which is what we would call southern Egypt or northern Sudan. They had migrated down the Nile Valley in 18,000 BC, and they stayed there for a long time. And around 3,500 BC, they were part agriculturalist, part pastoralist. They had cattle, they were doing agriculture, they were doing well. And there was another group of people, totally different people, that lived in a community not far away called the Masintu. These are the ancestors of what are called the Maasai people today.
Yes, yes.
These Masintu people were the first to learn the science and technology of smelting iron. And so they started to make iron instruments and iron weapons. And they would come to the Balanta people and communities and attempted to dominate them, make them pay tribute, give food and cattle. And the ancient Balanta ancestors, they're like, if you if you if you work with us, then you can share in these things. But if you don't work with us, you have no right to them. And so the Masintu people, they wanted to subjugate them and wage war. Since we didn't have the iron weapons, the elders didn't feel that they could win that. So they decided that because life is sacred and precious, it was better to migrate. And so that's what they did. And this is what caused them around 3500 BC. So this is a few hundred years just before Narmer, also known as Menes, invaded and united what are called the Two Lands and established the first dynasty in Kemet. So Balanta people leave the Nile Valley before Kemet is established. We have nothing to do with pharaohs. We have nothing to do with that hierarchical society. Obviously, we have nothing to do with the Hyksos invasion and the Shemshu Heru that eventually become known as Israel. We have nothing, the Habiru people, we have nothing to do with that. So some people, they want to shoehorn our history into that Abrahamic tradition. We were here long before that. We have nothing to do with that. We had migrated west. We had stopped and lived around Lake Chad area for hundreds of years. Even over 1,000 years. And what happened was when those foreign Semitic people had migrated into Kemet and started to wage war on the, black-skinned Nubians and push them further south from Kemet down into Nubia and Ethiopia, those same people also migrated west. When they came to Lake Chad, they found the Balanta people living there already. These were people unaffected by the class system that developed in Kemet, where you had a pharaoh and you had hierarchies. We didn't have any of that. Those people wanted to dominate us again. And all these people, look at them. They don't have chiefs and leaders. They're easy prey, whatever. So they thought. We resisted them. They couldn't conquer us. And so we started migrating again. The Balanta people, they migrated to what's called the Niger Valley. And that's when you started to have the kingdoms of Ouagadougou, Soninke, and the Mali empires. And the Balanta people were living in that area when you have the Epic of Sundiata, right?
Yes.
I hope you're familiar with your namesake book, right?
Very, very much so. And go ahead. Yes. But identify with the enslaved rebellion part of the Sundiata story and the Kuragan Yawa, which is a human rights document, and the Hunter's Oath, which begins with a life is a life and no life is greater than any other life. So that there's a lot of democratic humanism in the Malian Empire.
And this is essentially what Balanta people were holding on to. It was like everybody works, everybody eats. The Balanta culture and spirituality centers around what's called the vital life force essence. Every object that exists, animate and inanimate, has this life force energy. And it's always interacting with you. It's either increasing your life force energy or decreasing it. And the worst thing that can befall you, right, is that your vital life force energy reaches such a low level that you cease to exist as we know it. And if that happens without you reproducing your life force energy and passing it on to the next generation, that's the worst thing that could befall you, is to not reproduce and continue your progeny, your vital life force energy. Well, during that period, the 10th through 14th century, the Mali Empire, the Mali imperialists would travel to the southern border of their kingdom to try to subdue the people that were living freely. And that included the Balanta people. They were living in the southern border, and they would always resist the Mali Empire. And in fact, that's how they got their name Balanta. All that history I had just mentioned, we didn't actually call ourselves Balanta. We were called Brasa, okay? Barasa, which means the pure. Now, when the Mali Empire would come into our villages, the Balanta villages, the Balanta defense was kind of interesting. Life was so sacred to them that they would abandon the village, man, woman, and children. They would abandon the village. The soldiers would come in, find the village empty. They would take what they want, the cattle, whatever they want, return. Then we'd go back into our village. The elders would then call the warrior class and say, or the age group, they would be initiated into kind of warrior arts and say, now go back and get our stuff. And so they would go back at night, sneak, and this is where reparations start coming. They would go and retake what was theirs, their cattle, and bring it back to the villages.
No more.
Yeah, no more. They would take what was taken from them and return. And then they would reenact, and this part became, what they did, and they would reenact it through dance and through music and stomping on the ground. And this is how Balanta sort of dancing, drumming culture, storytelling culture kind of developed. But if any of those warriors got caught, the Mali Empire, they would cut off their hands, because the Mali, their judicial system said, "Oh, these are our cattle, and you are a thief."
Yeah.
Right? So you're a thief, so we cut off your hands. But from our legal system, they're like, "No, this is our reparations. This is our property," right? And as a result of that conflict, we were resisting the Mali Empire. Now, in Balanta culture, the word Alanta means man. And when we greet each other, we would say, "Man, you are sitting." Alanta, Hamese. We would say, "Man, you are standing." When we greet each other, it's a very present language. You start out by identifying what it is they're actually doing in the moment. Man, you're cooking. Man, you're reading. Man, you're sitting. You're standing. So it's Alanta, Alanta, Alanta. The Mandinka of the Mali Empire would go back and report to the king, to the emperor, say these people, these Alanta people, they just keep resisting. We can't submit them. These Alanta people. So Alanta, the plural is Balanta. So they took our own word for man, but used it to describe us as those who resist. And that's how we have carried that culture, and how Balanta people have had this reputation ever since as those who resist. We have been resisting alien domination since 3,500 BC. First, it was domination from the Maasai. Then it was domination from Kemetic refugees. Then it was domination from Muslim invaders. Then it was domination from West African imperialists. Then it was domination eventually by the Portuguese, right?
Absolutely.
Never. And so,
in the academic, I mean, I've read this stuff in terms of the slavers attempting to, subject the Balanta people, and the same methodology: migrate, leave, abandon the village, come back. And that I've read things where Portuguese claim that of all the peoples, they found it very, very difficult that they could not subjugate the Balanta. But what I'm really fascinated by is that there were about 25% of the ethnicities in Western and South Central Africa had similar communalist systems and values, and operated in similar ways in terms of mass democracy. Now, I know we have to account for gerontocracy, the rule of the old, and we have to account for patriarchy, but not as much as in a European society. But in the main, I think that's the democratic tradition that flows in African Americans. That is groups like the Balanta that played an outsized role in terms of the development of our political thought.
Yeah, in fact, so a couple of things. One, because we had no chiefs, leaders, if there was a problem that affected, several families, we would call a council. Okay, the different families would bring their head of the household. We would sit in council, and that's how we would manage. One of the great, what I think is the great attributes of that system was if you were free to dissent without penalty.
Yes.
Okay. So if you didn't agree with the consensus, you could dissent without penalty. Okay. So that was a feature. Now, during the time of the European invasion of the Dum Diversis War, right? There's a declaration of war that started capturing and trafficking these prisoners of war. Balanta couldn't be co-opted because they had no chief. They went and lived in the swamp areas, the hard to reach places, in order to protect themselves. And during that period, the elders realized that the young men, if they were allowed to sort of leave the village and have a lot of exposure to these Europeans, they might become opportunists, because that's what a lot of people were doing to get things that they did. So what they decided to do was, the men couldn't leave the village. And so it was the women who left the village, did all the trading, handled all of the foreign commerce, because they knew that the women, they weren't going to betray their husbands, sons, and uncles and brothers. So the Balanta women had a lot of power and a lot of independence and a lot of trust. They would go out, go to run the markets, handle all the money in order to protect the men by limiting their exposure to these foreigners. Their only exposure is, if they come into our village, we cut their heads off, right? If they're white, we cut their heads off and put them on sticks. If they're black, we tie them to a tree and we ransom them back to their families. Balanta never sold people into slavery.
Yeah, you know, it's amazing to me, and maybe it's because of the lack of knowledge about the Balanta and groups like that, that so much of African American, at least one aspect of the culture, you know, when people call themselves kings, you know, this is your queen, this is your king, that kind of backwardness, you know, yeah, we got to rip that foolishness out. And I do want to say this about the Europeans. The French did have the correct answer to royalty. And they had the correct answer. Like Balanta, you cut their heads off. You get rid of that. Yeah. So let us
one footnote. That lack of information is because of the Western bias. Western scholars felt that hierarchy and kings, having those kinds of state societies, was a mark of civilization.
That's right.
And so Western scholars, they put a premium on studying only those African people that had built those kinds of state structures. It's a European bias. They didn't consider that Balanta had their own state structure. It was just decentralized. And footnote on the other side, so you're familiar with Ella Baker.
Of course.
Right? Ella Baker was the one who told all those young people in SNCC, all those young people in Greensboro and Nashville, look, you don't have to, you are a leader where you are at. No longer is the civil rights movement going to be dominated by, you know, a few patriarchal Christian preachers. Right? You don't have to get their permission to do anything. You don't have to wait on them. You are a leader. So she decentralized the civil rights movement. She's a Balanta descendant. It's in her blood.
But see, I would go, wow, she's a Balanta descendant. Wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I do think we, you know, I don't accept these notions like it's in the blood. I think it's socialization and learning. I think that there's something in her family background where she was socialized.
Let me push back on you. You said on this program, you interrupt and you will push back. Now, I've studied epigenetics and I've studied DNA, right? And so epigenetics means that we encode in our DNA all of this information from our environment gets encoded in our DNA. And it has to, because if not, that means every generation has to start at ground zero. Fire. How does our body digest food? So the DNA is designed to retain important information, okay, epigenetically. our experiences get encoded. So you have a people that were never enslaved and never had that kind of authority of subsistence. It's not in the genetic makeup. When I say blood, I really meant DNA. Yes, in the same way that you can have the eyes or the nose of your grandmother, you can also have certain dispositions from your ancestors too. So I really do believe it's not a coincidence that she did these things in our liberation movement. She's fighting for freedom, just like Balanta. She's resisting. And she's saying, hey, we need to decentralize this thing. Okay, we don't have to have one leader. She actually said strong people don't need leaders.
Let me go back further and say that in the tradition, right, we could go to someone like Henry Adams, who led the Exodus movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things they did is they created what they called at the time a colonization council. Mm-hmm. And they distributed people to go live in the South and do the same work that our people normally did, right? So they're working on the plantations, they're working on the docks, and then they come back, they share the information, and then they make a decision to move west. Now, I don't know what Adams' background is. I don't know the background of Pat Singleton, but what I do know is that tradition,
yes,
gets passed on socially, right?
Yes,
because
it is.
Even if I accept your argument about the DNA and memory, it still comes down to individuals, right? But we're talking about how group decisions get made. There's a tradition amongst enslaved captive Africans and their African-American progeny that if you took something that the slave holder claimed as their property, that was not stealing, that was taking, because it was your labor that had produced their wealth. But if you took something from another enslaved person, or from a quasi-free black, or even a poor white person who owned no slaves, that was stealing, and that was morally wrong. Now that notion has to come out of not just the Balanta, but other groups, right, that had similar structures and values. And our argument is that we have to go back through our history and find those threads, and we have to raise those things up and connect them. And whether the DNA helps, there's a certain analysis.
Well, let me clarify. I don't want to be misunderstood. The DNA is not. I wasn't trying to suggest it's determinant or it's the only. So it's one of those things. It's not either or. It's both and. So I agree with you that sociologically and culturally, right, we have a tradition of councils. And if you actually go back and read John Henrik Clarke, or you read Credo Mutwa, or you go back with Sheikh Anta Diop, you go to any of them, they talk about before ancient Kemet, that's how we governed through these councils. And it was actually a council of mothers that had the sort of the major responsibility. And so we've always had that kind of cultural unity. That social hierarchy is actually an aberration when you look at the long history of us. But we've retained it in every generation. And so I 100% agree with you that that cultural manifestation was an organic continuation of a lot of what was already happening in West Africa at that time. I would 100% co-sign that.
Yeah. We're on the same page, my brother. We are on the same page. So but this is fascinating. I actually want to sit and talk with you a little bit more, but I do, there's other facets to your work that I want to come back to and talk about. So you played a vital role in getting the African Union to adopt the sixth division, the diaspora as a division. And so I want you to elaborate on what the sixth African division is in terms of the diaspora. And then I want to ask you about silences and underdeveloped aspects of the AU's view of its relationship to the diaspora division.
Okay. So in the late 1990s, the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, realized that it had accomplished its overall main objective, which was to liberate the African continent. So you had South Africa in 1994, Mandela comes out of prison, you have the end of apartheid. The OAU had kind of outlived its mandate, and so now realized that it needed to evolve, become something else, and have a new mandate. And so it transitioned into what we call the African Union. At the first extraordinary session of the African Union, they decided to amend the Constitution with the Article 3Q amendment that officially invites and encourages the African diaspora to fully participate in building the African Union. Okay, so this was a milestone in our history. For the first time since the invasion and the trafficking and enslavement of African prisoners of war, was the formal reconnection, right, that would allow us, Black people in America, or Black people in the Caribbean, or Black people in Central America, to participate in the governing of the continent. This happened in 2003. This is exactly what Malcolm had asked for when he spoke to the OAU in 1964, and he said, "Our problems are your problems are our problems." And the OAU had given him observer status because we didn't have a state yet.
Right.
But they gave him observer status. So this was sort of the natural evolution of that. I just so happened to be there in the room at the African Union as the sole representative of Black people in America and the African diaspora when this thing happened. I was a young man.
Brother, you just happened to be in the room.
I just happened to be there
for years to make that argument, right?
No, what had happened was I went to Ethiopia in 2003, and one of the elder Rosses said, "Hey, you're Ross Nathaniel. You write for Rastafari Speaks newspaper, don't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Come with me." And he took me down to the Ministry of Information and had me register as a journalist for the Rastafari Speaks newspaper. And I got my government media credentials, which allowed me to, as a journalist, go to the African Union, go in the building, and cover the events. I didn't go to Ethiopia planning to attend this meeting. This was not my idea. This was the idea of an elder who recognized what I could contribute because of who I was and what I was doing at the time. So when I say I just happened to be there, I literally mean I just happened to be there. And when I went into the building, I was totally inexperienced. So the first thing I did was I asked the African Union's Press and Information Protocol Officer, "Where are the other African-American journalists?" And he looked at me and he laughed. He said, "There are no other African. You're the only one here." Because this just wasn't on our radar at the time. So this is how I ended up being the only one in the room at that time. Now, there were some Ethiopian journalists. You know, once you get the press credentials, you can take, they have a press room where there's desks and phones and computers, and you can hang out there. So I started hanging out in the press room. I started to get to know some of the foreign journalists, the Ethiopian journalists, and they start to school me and take me under their wing. Of course, I'm the only dreadlock Rastafari in the place. And one of them told me, he said, look, in the closed door meetings, when they come out, you go in the room and pick up whatever papers are on the table. That's how you're going to find out what it was they were talking about. So I started doing that, and this is how I started getting informed on what's really going on. Now, at that first extraordinary session of the AU, when they included the diaspora, they had a press conference. And I'm waiting the whole time in the press conference for somebody to ask a question about this. Everybody was there, CNN, BBC, you name it, right? Now me, I was a journalist. I wrote articles for a little Rastafari Speaks newspaper. I never interviewed heads of state with international, I'm totally out of my league here. But yeah, I did graduate from Yale, so I've got some intelligence, and I don't feel inferior to anyone. So I'm looking around, nobody's asking the question, and I'm hearing that little voice. This is why you're in the room. You're here to represent the diaspora. If nobody asked the question about the diaspora initiative, you got to do it. So towards the end of that press conference, I stood up, and I was studying all the other journalists, and I stood up and I said, Ross Nathaniel, Rastafari Speaks newspaper. And at the time, the AU chairperson was South African President Thabo Mbeki. And I said, Mr. Chair, and I questioned Thabo Mbeki. I said, could you please elaborate on your discussions concerning the Article 3Q amendment and how you're going to include the African diaspora? And he gave a complete non-answer because they hadn't worked out any details. All they knew was they needed to include the diaspora because we actually started Pan-Africanism, right? Those of us in the West, we started it. Right. They knew we needed, but they hadn't worked out any of the details.
So let me ask you this question. When the people in the AU, and I love Thabo Mbeki's father, Govan. I read all his, brilliant Black Marxists. Thabo, I'm not for it, but are they thinking about the captives who were brought over from the 15th century through the 19th, or are they thinking about the African immigrants who in the 1980s began to move into places like the U.S.? Those people who are the petty bourgeois who are fleeing their countries for the opportunities in the mainland of the capitalist world.
So the answer to that, the answer to that question is yes and no and both. In fact, it was a debate. Okay, it was a debate. Okay, it was Senegalese President Abdoulaye Wade who was the one who introduced the amendment. Okay. Now, for those that don't know, this president of Senegal, Abdoulaye Wade, he was at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban 2 years prior and walked out because he did not support reparations because his family were big-time slave traders. Okay. So he had introduced this, and him and those that were part of his group, because at the time they were studying this problem that they called brain drain. All these African professionals that were leaving the African continent and going to places, principally Europe, America, some in the Caribbean, doctors, lawyers, educators, nurses, teachers, all these people, they were leaving the continent. And they wanted to try to find a way to reverse the brain drain into brain gain. Now, right at this time, in Addis Ababa, not only is there the African Union, there's also what's called the Economic Commission for Africa. They do all of the economic studies. And they had just done a series of studies, because I was a Yale nerd, right? So I would go and read the studies, right?
Yeah, right.
And then they were saying that the way to reverse the brain drain and make it a brain gain is to have these, what I call expensive working vacations, and offer that to the expatriate Ghanaian and Nigerian, right, to get them to come back. So that group, they weren't thinking about us. In fact, they were hostile to including
Yeah.
what is called the historic diaspora, those of us who are descendants of the prisoners of war that were taken. There were others that had a higher level of consciousness, and they were like, no, right? They were Pan-African in consciousness. They were like, no, this has to be, we have to include all of the African people outside like Garvey, those at home and those abroad. We were those abroad. So it was a debate.
So now, who are those people who are arguing for full inclusion of those of us who were trafficked?
I don't remember specifically which presidents. I just remember mostly Thabo Mbeki and Abdullah Wade were kind of the main figures in the debate. But they didn't settle the debate
for broad inclusion.
Yeah. And
Okay.
they didn't settle the debate at that meeting. It took several other meetings for them to come up with a definition of the diaspora and to start working out the details. And it's been a struggle and a fight ever since. I'll give you one concrete example of what I mean by that. So after they made this amendment, okay, diaspora, you're now going to help us build this African Union and build the continent. We're going to start by giving you 20 of the 150 seats on the African Union Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. So this is one of the organs of the AU. And it made sense. The thing that connects us is economics, trade, culture, music, food, dance, sports, things like that, and social ties. So, all right, that's a good starting point. Let's get them on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. Give them 20 seats. Now, because I had access to the information because I was the only one there, I started studying all of this, and I realized if I don't report this, our side, African Americans, we don't know about this. So I started writing. This was, the internet was just starting to become a thing. I start writing reports, sending it out, sending it to journalists, asking, "Hey, is this being reported in the Black press?" And I had read some of the details, and basically they were saying, "Okay, diaspora, organize yourself. You choose your 20 representatives." But they didn't have any instructions on how to go about doing that. It was for us to do that. So I had read that in their documents that they had created this thing called the Western Hemisphere African Diaspora Network. This was going to be the interface for us to interface with the African Union. So I drafted a memorandum of understanding, creating what was called the AU 6th Region Education Campaign. Because the African Union was constructed, it has 5 regions: North, South, East, West, and Central. Those are the 5 regions. This new amendment made the whole diaspora the African Union 6th region. So I realized that first we got to educate the 6th region on what has happened and what the significance of it is. Then we got to come up with a process for 250 million of us in the Western Hemisphere. How are we going to, Balanta now, how are we going to equitably and fairly, right, and sort of democratically, right, fill those seats? So what I did was I left Ethiopia, I came to the West, I started reporting on this, and the first person to really respond was Professor Dr. David Horn out of California, who was a leader in the Pan-African Organizing Committee, PAOC. He read all the information, understood it, and partnered with me. And he and I drafted a procedure for traveling throughout the Western Hemisphere, setting up elders councils who would oversee town hall meetings that would nominate people and elect people to be their representatives for that particular location. And then So we decided there'd be 2 from every state. So America would have 100, right, representatives, 2 for each state. We go to Canada. We go to Organize Canada. They're going to have theirs. We went to Honduras and Panama to help the Central Americans. We went to the Caribbean. We went to Trinidad and Jamaica and Barbados, right? So we had figured out this process that everybody could participate in. And then all of the people that got elected, they would sit in a Congress and amongst themselves decide who would be the 20 based on population size. Okay, so Brazil has got the largest amount, and then North America based on population size. So out of 20 is like America gets 4, Brazil gets 4, Canada gets 2, Caribbean gets 3, that kind of thing. And we started engaging in this because I had an MOU with the African Union. They gave me the authority to run this campaign and make this happen. Now, after the first couple of elections, and they realized it was us that was getting elected, the historic diaspora, not the expatriate Africans. That's when they pulled the plug.
I'll be there.
That's when they pulled the plug and they said, this is not exactly what we intended. We didn't, this was what, so that's when I started to see that the African Union was, in my opinion now, disingenuous. And today we still have not taken those 20 seats. And we still, to this day, what's that?
It's the colonized bourgeoisie, most of it.
Of course. At that time, in the beginning, on good faith, I didn't know what it was going to be. I was just excited. Can you imagine? I'm a young man. I know about Malcolm representing the 22 million African Americans at the OAU. Now the OAU has transitioned to the AU. And now I'm the only one there. Okay? Now, little footnote. So by this point, I had already been kind of mentored and trained by Dr. Y.N. Clyde, who was one of Malcolm's best students and had established the Canadian chapter of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And I lived in the basement of Elder Ross Gabriel, who was a colleague of Malcolm's in New York. So I had this kind of connection to Malcolm in that way. And I knew all of these stories from people that were closely tied to him. So I was quite aware and conscious of, I'm at the AU. I'm the only African American here. I'm getting all this information. It's on my shoulders, just like it was on Malcolm's. But of course, I'm no Malcolm X. Nobody knew who I was. People in the Rasta world knew who I was, but African American community, they didn't know who I was. So I wasn't a Malcolm X, but I was in that same role. So
you're in that space, yes.
Yeah, which is one reason why I serve as Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, and why I do the work that I do today, whether it's bringing our case to the International Court of Justice, engaging with the African Union, writing citizenship legislation for African countries, all of these things. It stems from this period in my life where it's like the torch is being passed from one generation to the next. You have a new OAU to the AU, right? You have the Malcolmites, all of those who are the legacy of Malcolm. We have to do our work and fulfill our historical imperative in our day and age.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I do want to go to the chat, and I don't want to overkeep you because I know you're doing us a tremendous service by getting up at midnight and getting Basal time. But
hey, I'm enjoying it. I'm here for as long as you can have me. So don't worry about that. If you've got questions, let's answer them.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. So here's a question that I had. I was reading the AAU Constitution and documents, and I was struck by a clause, and I can't remember the clause. I should have looked it up. But they say that the Diaspora Initiative also obligates them to provide aid and support. You know which clause I'm talking about?
Well,
And
it's not a
I'm wondering,
quasi-AU constitution, but there have been a series of technical workshops and a development of what they call the Diaspora Initiative. And they have an organ at the AU that oversees the development of this.
okay,
And
that's
there are
why.
many, yeah, there are many things that they are supposed to be doing. The Holy Grail was establishing a database, literally like a citizen registration of all 250 million of us, and a skill set database. So that, for example, um, before giving an international contract to say build a road, they're supposed to consult the diaspora database to see if anybody in the diaspora can handle this project and this contract. So it's preferential trade agreements and things like that. So there are all these things that are supposed to be an engagement between the diaspora, the sixth region, and the other five regions. But the AU sixth region still doesn't exist formally as embedded organs and institutions within the AU. Right now, it's still just a concept and an ad hoc movement. They haven't formalized it yet.
Okay, but as you indicated earlier, it puts us on the road toward the fulfillment of Malcolm's plan. So it's going to be it will be a struggle, and a struggle that's going to manifest itself in a couple of ways. I'm aware that there's a large number of African Americans who are returning to places like Ghana, but the impact they're having is one of gentrification, in the same way that young white mobiles move into Black communities and gentrify and make it impossible for those who are already there to pay the rental fees and the cost of everything as they go up, taxes, etc. So we're having that kind of negative impact. And I'm also aware that, or at least it seems to me, that the African Americans that are being recruited are, of course, the petty bourgeoisie who are in the technical manager professional strata, because they can, quote unquote, have nation building skills. And clearly that class component has to be worked out. So this is my last question about the continent. Are there forces that hold to Nkrumah's understanding of Pan-Africanism, that we are talking about the unification of the continent under one socialist government?
Yes, but you're not.
In the
Yes,
AU?
they're on the continent, but you're not going to find them in the AU.
Okay. They're the social forces down on the ground.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So look, I want to switch and do a little bit more about you in terms of you're a fitness guru. Can you talk about the Baleka method? And the reason I say this is, look, U.S. capital, in terms of their food production, has poisoned us.
Yes.
You know, if we were to just look at a picture of Black folk in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then look at a picture today, it's horrific. We were once most fit people, well, maybe the Maasai, but we were very fit people on this planet. We now are suffering from heart ailments, diabetes, and just a range of diseases. And you've got a fitness plan that clearly works. So tell us about that aspect of what you do.
So, yes, I was a world-class swimmer. So I had this physique, this swimmer's body, 5% body fat. You could see all my muscles. And then when I retired, I didn't do anything. And at one point, I became a long-haul truck driver in the United States for a brief 4 years. I had stopped my traveling. I was sort of burnt out. This was after right after this period where I was at the AU and running this campaign, I was disillusioned. I was burnt out. Had issues with a lot of the elders who were talking about, we got to unify, and they can't sit in a room with each other because they have all this bad history. And that's why I'm a young man looking up to these elders. And anyways, I was burnt out, and I had never made any real money before, and I was having this financial issue. So I got into long haul truck driving, and then, as everybody knows, in America, truck drivers are the workers with the highest rate of obesity. 86% of America's long haul truck drivers are overweight or obese. And so when I got into long haul truck driving, I had gained 10% of my body weight in the first 2 months. And I realized if I didn't take
Yeah, he's freezing. Siphiwe, you're freezing. Let's I'm gonna give it another couple of minutes, and then I'll take you out and see if I bring you back in, if that will solve our problem. All right, I'm gonna search the chat and see if there's a question that I can respond to while we give our guests a little more time. There's an observation by James that it's this addiction to the aristocracy that explains why cultural nationalists lean right, because kingships and empires are always imperialists. Okay. See questions. Yeah. Okay, good people. I don't. There's some good questions here, but I don't see any that I should respond to. What we'll do is we'll get Brother Sipway back uh, in the early fall. So let me get ready to bring this to an end. Thank you all for participating. It was wonderful, stimulating discussion, and let me bring it to an end.